Hello, this is my intro and week one lecture. So, my name is Elizabeth Green, and I am your instructor for U.S. History Part 2 online. So, a few things that I want to tell you about. First of all, make sure that you are regularly looking at that syllabus. There will be things posted every week that you will be expected to do. You are welcome to email me. I'm going to post another video in which I go over the syllabus. So if you haven't watched that already, you will want to watch that. And basically, this is our adventure together. So here we go. Some things you need to know about me. I love U.S. history. I believe U.S. history is absolutely essential to understanding where we are today and even where we're going in the future. 2020 is a very interesting year. We have a large election coming up that has inspired a lot of emotions. At the time I am recording this, impeachment is still in the talks. And so a lot of what we're going to do is going to reflect those things. So I understand that sometimes you lose the face to face. So here we are. Hi. You want to say hi? Nice to meet you. Okay, so let's get started. Our first lecture is going to be on the Gilded Age. Now, I will also list some other assignments and things that you can do for each unit. Sometimes there will be support videos and different things. And occasionally, as we're videoing, I'm going to remember things that I will mention to you. So just to kind of bring you in, there is going to be posted an intro video on the Civil War and Reconstruction, mainly because to understand where we are with the Gilded Age, you kind of have to understand what's going on with all of that. You also find that I love Hollywood. I love movies. And there's a lot of movies that reflect historical events in a way that it gives you an appreciation for them. Don't define them by those, but use that to appreciate. So here's where we want to start. Okay, so first, let's kind of pick up with the end of Reconstruction. So just to let you know, the Civil War took place from 1861 to 1865. There was a severe divide between the North and the South, and it ends in April of 1865 with two cataclysmic events. Basically, the South finds out that they are beaten and they are forever traumatized. In fact, I know that's something that a lot of Southerners still haven't gotten over. With that, just a few short days later, in fact, that was Palm Sunday. On Good Friday, you're going to see Abraham Lincoln is going to be shot inside a theater. He dies early the next morning, and he is now gone. And so Reconstruction is going to be conducted by Lincoln's vice president, who was an odd choice. The reason he was there was basically because he was a Democrat and Lincoln was a Republican, and they were trying to unify the North. Not the best choice. He is going to come in and he is going to fight everything that was trying to be done by Congress to improve life for African Americans. He hates the South, both white and black, and because of that, he tries to punish those groups in its entirety. And so it is going to lead to Congress taking over Reconstruction. During that time, Ulysses S. Grant is elected, and Ulysses S. Grant was a great general for the North. However, he was not the best president. A few things about him: he was an alcoholic, tons of scandal is going to riddle his presidency. And so with all of that, it kind of makes for bad feelings towards the presidency and towards the government. To kind of give you a little input in that, a couple of the things that were happening during his administration, a lot of the people he put in place did some really bad things. In fact, one of those is he was convinced to sell off massive amounts of our gold supply for paper money. Now let's review. Gold, limited resource. Paper money, not smart, but the government can print as much as they want to. Should you trade a limited resource for something that you decide the numbers on? Probably not. A second thing that was a big issue during his administration were political machines. Now, the reading that you're going to do and respond to this week is going to be a case study. And it's out of the case study book. And that particular case study focuses on some of the scandals that were going to take place with the political machines and political bosses. Political machines are a group of people in a city that control those city politics. That means they control government contracts, they control elections, they control who gets those government contracts. How do they do this? How are they so successful at it? Well, at the time, the cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia, they were blowing up with immigrants coming in because we were in the middle of our own industrial revolution. And so, because these immigrants were coming in to fulfill those jobs that were available in the North, they are very quickly recruited by these political machines. They help them get jobs, they help them find a place to live, and then they expect them to vote. What you will find in the case study is voting was very different. Voting was very public. Today, voting is a very private matter. People do not know who you vote for. They can make guesses based on stereotypes and speculations, but 100% they don't know what box you check. Back then, the ballots were colorful ballots, and everybody could see what ballot you picked and which ballot you dropped in. And in fact, it was a very public thing. And so, because of that, the scandals were just unbelievable. Their slogan was vote early and vote often. And so, with this, one particular political boss I want to focus on is a guy named William Marcy Tweed. If you've seen the movie Gangs in New York, it talks about the Tweed Ring and Tammany Hall. And so, Tweed controlled New York politics. In fact, he stole millions of dollars in 7 years from New York City. Some estimates are as low as 20 million in 7 years. Some are as high as 200 million. Either way, that's a heck of a lot of money. In fact, it's going to take the efforts of a political cartoonist by the name of Thomas Nast, exposing him to actually put him in jail. He actually escapes, makes it to Europe, and they recognize him because of those political cartoons talking about his illegal practices with voting. But you'll read all about that in the case study. All right. Another scandal that's going to take place is the Credit Mobile scandal. This was where the Union Pacific Railroad Company had construction companies that reported 348% dividends on their stocks. They gave key shares to congressmen, and even the vice president under Grant was involved. Tisk, tisk. To add to that as well, there was another scandal in 1874 to 75 called the Whiskey Ring. Grant's slogan, he said, "Let no guilty escape." But then he turns around and he pardoned his personal secretary. Not good. In fact, the Secretary of War, William Belknap, is even going to have to resign for pocketing bribes for supplies that were supposed to go to Native American reservations. So not good either. Grant was easily elected for 2 terms, despite the fact things did not go well. An economic crash is going to happen in 73 shortly after his election. Why? Because we had severe money problems. During the war, there was $450 million worth of folding money or paper money that was issued. By 1868, 100 million of that was removed from circulation. Now, we always think about inflation as being the bad guy, but deflation is scary as well, because if you owe money and your income goes down, you still owe that money. Agrarian societies, agriculture, farmers, in other words, and debtors always want inflation. Why? Because your bill, your mortgage stays the same, but your income's going up. I want my income to inflate. My car payment, I just paid it off, stayed the same for all the years I owed it, but my income would go up. So there was inflation. My mortgage, I have lived in my house for 13 years, and my mortgage has stayed the same for all of those years, but my income has gone up. And so I want inflation in my income. So debtors want inflation. All right. So Grant actually vetoes a bill to print more paper money. And so that's going to bring a lot of issues with the farmers, and they're going to demand help with this. They actually even create a political party called the Greenback Labor Party. They had 1 million votes and 14 members to get elected from Congress. Let's talk about patronage. Patronage, basically parties were supported by the same people who had supported them for generations. If your grandpappy was a this, then you are a this. If your grandpappy was a that, then you are that. And so it was kind of a tradition there. Most of you, If you think about your political leanings, be they Democratic, Republican, God knows what, it's probably the same political leanings of your family, more than likely. Sometimes not so much, but more than likely. So let's get to the election of 1876. The Republicans run a guy named Rutherford B. Hayes. He was out of Ohio, and his nickname was the Great Unknown. He had been a governor there for 3 terms, excuse me. He runs against a Democrat by the name of Samuel Tilden. Now, remember, we talked about Boss Tweed of the Tweed Ring, and he was arrested. Samuel Tilden was actually the district attorney who managed to get him arrested. He prosecuted and he got it. State attorney, actually. Tilden gets 184 out of the 185 electoral votes needed. There were 20 unaccounted for electoral votes. So Hayes had 165. The reason those were unaccounted for, 4 states sent in 2 sets of electoral returns. So what do? The Constitution says if electoral returns are questioned, then it goes to Congress. So Congress meets and they break this with the Compromise of 1877. It was under the Electoral Count Act. They put together a 15-member committee, members of the Senate, the House, and the Supreme Court. But that part really doesn't matter. Here's where it matters. 8 members were Republican, 7 were Democrats. Even if it would have been flipped, whoever has the majority is going to win. Well, the Democrats were furious because they knew that the Republicans were going to pick a Republican. And so they demand that something be done. In fact, some even threatened to secede again. Like, we will secede again as the South and we'll go do our own thing. And so Congress said, well, we can't have that. And so instead, they're going to issue what is called the Compromise of 1877. Hayes will become president, and military reconstruction, martial law in the South is going to end. And so all of the rights that had been gained for African Americans during Reconstruction are going to be taken away. So let's talk about this. African Americans, after the Civil War, had no jobs. Many had no skills. And so a lot are going to end up in sharecropping systems back on the farm where they were slaves. African Americans found sharecropping as their main form of survival. Occasionally you'll see it called tenant farming in the crop lien system. Literacy requirements, or voter registration laws, and poll tax were put in place to restrict African Americans from voting. You see, that right had been guaranteed as part of the 3 civil rights amendments that are passed right after the Civil War. The first is the 13th Amendment, which outlaws slavery, except for in the case of criminal activity, you cannot be in voluntary servitude. The second is the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship and equal protection under the law for African Americans or anyone born in the U.S. And the last one is the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment is designated to guarantee that all men can vote, no matter what race. And so, yes, those are going to be put in place. And for a while, they are going to be upheld. But you have groups like the KKK who come in and they start to use vigilante tactics to scare people to keep them from voting. You have jobs that are going to be lost to keep people from voting. You have people who get evicted from their homes or even physically harmed. If you haven't seen The Free State of Jones, I would strongly recommend that film. It is one of my favorites about this time period. It is very much based on a true story, and it's pretty recent, and it's just a really good film. And it shows some of this voter intimidation. In 1890, a lot of this was really sealed for African Americans with the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson said that African Americans could be segregated, basically. It was a court case centered around a train car dispute in Louisiana. And so there was a Louisiana train car law said that train cars would be segregated based on race. That was perfectly fine. And so in New Orleans, this is going to be fought by a guy named Homer Plessy. He is going to be involved with a group that decides to dispute this. And so he contacts the streetcar company, he and his friends, and they said, look, we want to dispute the law. They told him they were going to do it. And so this is what happens. And Ferguson was the owner of the streetcar company. And so when he was removed from the car, they sued. And so it becomes Plessy versus Ferguson. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and they're hoping the Supreme Court will strike down this law under the 14th Amendment of equal protection. But instead they said, well, as long as it is equal. And so that's why that word is used by the Supreme Court, is that equal protection under the law. As long as the cars are equal, it's okay. Unfortunately, for until 1954, it was deemed to be okay. I digress, but man. You're also going to see labor clashes with the nation's 4 largest railroads have to cut wages by 10%. This is particularly difficult for both the Irish and the Chinese. Many Chinese left California and returned with family. Few women came in this era few Chinese women, because the horrible conditions, and some who did actually found themselves in the sex trade. They were sold into prostitution with sex trafficking, basically. They were promised husbands if they came over. They were told there were job opportunities, and they found themselves in a place where they knew no one. It's horrible. However, this dispute is going to erupt between the Irish and the Chinese, and realistically, the Irish are the antagonizers here. A guy by the name of Dennis Kearney is going to lead the Kearneyites, also known as the Beefeaters, and they begin to abuse the Chinese. They would even cut off their pigtails and even kill some outright. So how do you stop this? Well, the U.S. government said, well, if the Chinese are getting attacked, we've got to stop that. How do we do it? We stop Chinese immigration. What? Yes, that is what they ruled. And Chinese could not immigrate people unless they were highly skilled. So unskilled workers, no shot for you if you're Chinese. And if you already lived here and you were Chinese or of Chinese descent, you could not become a citizen, despite the fact the 14th Amendment said you could if you were born here. And so a gentleman by the name of Wong Kim Ark tried to sue in 1898 under the 14th Amendment, and the Supreme Court struck it down and said, yeah, well, this is how it is. Get over it. So the election of 1880 is a very interesting one, because you have James Garfield is going to be elected. He is going to be shot at a railroad station on July 2nd. He dies on September the 19th, 1881. All right. Basically, the guy who shot him was a guy named Charles Guiteau. Now, Charles Guiteau was found guilty and hanged, but the reason he said that he did it was because he wanted the vice president, a man named Chester Arthur, to be given this job. He liked the vice president better than the president. Why? Because the vice president was pro-reform. And so he said, we need reform. So let's make this happen. Let's kill the president and get the vice president out. What kind of reform? Civil service reform. If you work for the civil service, it means you work for the government. Now, back under President Andrew Jackson, people were allowed to work for the government based on their commitment to the president. The Constitution says the president can appoint domestic offices or positions. One of the biggest civil service agencies is our post offices. So all of your head postmasters in every post office is determined by who is in the presidency. Still today. So 2020, those guys may have a job or they may not. So we'll see how that all pans out. So Chester Arthur, the new president in 1881, is going to pass the Pendleton Act of 1883. What it does is it said federal employees had to take a civil service test applicable to their job to get the job. So you can still hire your friends, but your friends have to be qualified. We don't want you hiring people who can't read to run the post office. The election of 1884, the Republicans are going to run a guy named James Blaine, who did not pull for reform, and the Democrats are going to run a guy named Grover Cleveland. Blaine was involved in some corrupt dealings with some of the Southern railroads, and so Cleveland comes out as kind of the squeaky clean candidate. However, he wasn't that squeaky clean. In fact, as you will see on the cartoon, Cleveland had a child that by a woman who wasn't his wife. And yeah, that was born while he was married to his wife. So that never goes over well. But even with that, he still wins. He was the first Democrat in the White House since Buchanan because the Democrats have been associated strongly with the South. So Cleveland is in office, and he was a strong believer in laissez-faire economics, which means the government shouldn't really interfere in politics. He vetoed bills that would give help to Texas farmers. He put 2 Confederates on the cabinet, kind of questionable decision there. He vetoed several thousands of dollars for veterans' pensions. Now, before you're like, well, that's not cool. Well, let's just put it this way to make it real simple. These were guys who actually had not served in the war. So, not even like worked for the Army. So, why are they getting a pension? They were not deserving of the pension. So, the Treasury actually runs a surplus. We have extra money. And so, what he wants to do is scale back the tariff to make up for that money. Although extra money is good to have, it's not fair to overtax your people. And so that's what he wanted to do. Well, in 1888, he is defeated, and Benjamin Harrison, a Republican, is elected. And Harrison does not prove himself to be a very worthy president. He beats Cleveland 233 to 168 electoral votes. And he and Congress are going to come up with over $1 billion spending deal. They go through all of that surplus. And at the same time, they pass the highest tariff that had been in U.S. history up until that point. And by the way, remember those people who were veterans that weren't veterans? They got that pension. Way to go. Anyway, so flashing forward a little bit, 1892, the same 2 guys run. You're going to have Harrison and you're going to have Cleveland, but this time Cleveland wins. However, before he even comes into office, economic panic starts. 8,000 businesses collapse in 6 months. And so the gold reserve had sunk so low that it wasn't even able to back our dollar. In fact, we're going to have to get a loan from JP Morgan, who we will talk about later, to get our gold supply back up to a safe amount. And so all of that money that was the surplus, Cleveland really needed, but it was gone. The Wilson-Gorman tariff is going to barely lower the tariff, and it tries to put in place an income tax, but the Supreme Court strikes that down. And so Cleveland becomes the last of whom we call the forgotten presidents: Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland. All right, so let's talk a little bit about industry. In 1865, 35,000 miles of steam railroad track was built by the government. And in response, those railroad companies would get about 3 cents an acre for that land. Frontier villages that the railroad went through would flourish, and those that do not get the railroad, they basically die like ghost towns. In 1862, the gold rush in California began to bring more people there. Of course, there had been a gold rush in 49, as you know, probably. And so what happens is these railroad companies demand more and more and more track. And so that's going to take place. The first transcontinental railroad that stretches from coast to coast is going to be at Promontory Point, Utah. The Golden Spike will be driven in. The Union Pacific Railroad laid 1,086 miles of track, and the Central Pacific laid 689 because they were going through the Sierra Mountains. 4 transcontinental lines are going to be completed by 1900. Railroads are going to improve because steel was used in place of iron. Also, they're going to have air brakes. You're going to have palace cars or nice places that you can sleep. They're able to take their farmers their items, and that's really nice. They also develop refrigerated cars so you can carry meat to market. This is good stuff. The railroads also help establish official time zones and standardized times so you don't have, those kind of problems with trains going at different points. You do have a lot of dirty dealings with the railroad, and that's kind of a big deal. So America enters into kind of her second industrial revolution with new inventions. Mass immigration with cheap, unskilled labor was plentiful. With this, we're going to see Eli Whitney. His interchangeable parts is going to be huge. Businesses use cash registers, stock tickers, typewriters, and things to make it quicker. Alexander Graham Bell's invention, the telephone, coupled with the telegraph, allowed for almost instantaneous communication. Nothing like today, but compared to where you would only hear from somebody with a letter. This was massive. Also, we're going to see Thomas Edison, I know Tesla as well, with the light bulb. So this means that factories could work into the evening hours. That's going to be huge as well. You begin to have these big corporations to develop larger companies and not just your small mom and pop businesses. With these, you have a rise of men who are extremely wealthy. And those are going to be Carnegie, who is going to make his money in steel through vertical integration. He cheapens his product, which makes it sell more. The lower the price, the more you sell. Rockefeller, who becomes a huge oil baron through horizontal consolidation, a billionaire through his trust. In fact, by the time he sells off his company, he produces over 90% of the United States supply of oil and over 1/3 of the world supply of oil. It was the first billion-dollar company, the Standard Oil Company, along with the Bessemer process. Or, I'm sorry, it was the second billion-dollar company. He was the first billionaire. The first billion-dollar company is Carnegie's company, but he sells it to J.P. Morgan, who turns it into U.S. Steel. And U.S. Steel becomes the first billion-dollar company. Carnegie forces him to buy for over like $400 million. J.P. Morgan is going to be a banker. And so he makes his money through investments and through stocks. And he is going to be kind of the third big name here, along with Vanderbilt, like Vanderbilt University. The Vanderbilt family was very wealthy. They're going to own the Biltmore House and some other places and obviously contribute to the university there. These guys were really big about making money, but on the same hand, they're really big with philanthropy and donating money to improve life for others. So agriculture is having some huge problems at this time. Some of those include things like overproduction, falling prices, high prices caused by tariff, massive debt. They wanted cheaper money, as we talked about the need for inflation, as well as better railroads. And the government does not address those needs. So we try to make some reforms, and let's talk a little bit about those. First of all, you had the National Grange, which was a national farm organization that attempted to make for fair railroad rates and better rights for farmers and to bring inflation. That group is eventually going to turn into the Greenback Labor Party that we talked about a few minutes ago, which eventually turns into the Populist Party. The Populist Party is one of the most successful third parties in U.S. history. It never reached a major party status. Basically, they believed in free and unlimited coinage of gold and silver. Not just gold, but they wanted silver to also back the dollar at a $16 to 1 ounce ratio, which was actually a really pretty high ratio. So it was good for people who had silver. The government ownership, they wanted them to own the railroads, the telegraphs, and the telephones. Now, when the government owns industries, basically that's communism. But those industries were so corrupt that they wanted something done. No more laissez-faire, basically. They also wanted unused railroad land to be returned to the government so it could be used for people who needed it. They wanted graduated income tax, which means that you would pay on a tax bracket, basically, kind of like what we have today, but that's what they wanted. It wasn't a thing yet. They wanted the government to store extra crops and to make loans to farmers to help keep them secure. The farmers can't feed us if they can't make their bills. They wanted political reforms that included U.S. senators being elected by the people. At the time, the state government would choose your senators, and so your senators weren't loyal to you. They were loyal to the state government. They wanted also secret ballot. No more of those color ballots. And of course, you're going to read about that in your case study. And so lastly, they wanted to lower the tariff and they wanted improved working conditions for labor. Let's talk about the election of 1896. Republican William McKinley is going to run, and he's going to be managed by a guy named Mark Hanna. He was very pro-business, gold standard for money, and Hanna's really going to get his name out there. He's kind of a modern politician. The Democrats nominate the youngest man to ever be nominated for president. He was 35, and he made it on a major party ticket. That is the youngest you can be and be president. He was for the coinage of silver. In fact, he caused a split in the Democratic Party because some didn't like that. The populists are going to join those Democrats, and the Democrats who split are going to join the Republicans. And so with this, he campaigns on his famous Cross of Gold speech, saying that they were basically crucifying the farmer on a cross of gold by not allowing silver to back the dollar. And so Bryan is going to be appealing because he terrified Republicans. They raised much money through his campaign, and it's going to be full of propaganda. I hope that helps you guys out, and I will have a video for you soon. Thank you. Have a good day. Okay.